Chapter 23 of Christianity in the Apostolic Age. Christianity in the Apostolic Age by George Purves. Progress of Christianity to the close of the Apostolic Age. Historical sources. Section 272. The anonymous epistle to the Hebrews is valuable, both for its incidental references to the condition of Judaic Christianity, cf. section 172, and for its own teaching. In the latter aspect, it is a source for the period now before us. Its authorship has ever been a subject of dispute, for even in ancient times, while the Eastern churches received it as Pauline, there was dissent in the West, and Tertullian states that it was ascribed to Barnabas. There is, however, no book more certainly written in the Apostolic Age, since it was used freely by Clement of Rome, AD 96. Its internal features make strongly against the tradition that it was written by Paul. Its anonymity is unlike Paul. The writer appeals to the confirmation of the Lord's message, which he and his readers had received from those who had heard him, chapter 2, verse 3, chapter 4, verse 2. He had apparently been associated with his readers in the earlier days of their Christian life, cf. chapter 2, verse 4, chapter 10, verse 32, chapter 13, verse 7. His smooth style and his greater fondness for the Septuagint point also to another hand than the apostles'. The Alexandrianism of the epistle has indeed been exaggerated. Its interpretations of Scripture assume, like Paul's and unlike Philo's, the historical reality of the inspired narrative, and his conceptions show no dependence on the philosopher. Yet there remain a number of phrases and observations which indicate the writer's familiarity with Alexandrian terminology. Most decisive, however, is the difference of the form of theological conception from Paul's. Both entirely harmonize, but the Pauline expression of salvation in Christ is replaced by that of the believer as sanctified by the work of his priestly representative, cf. chapter 2, verse 11, chapter 10, verse 10, 14, and 29, chapter 13, verse 12. Salvation is not described as justification, but as the perfecting of man's relation to God, cf. chapter 6, verse 1, chapter 7, verse 11 and 19, chapter 9, verse 9, chapter 10, verses 1, 14, and 40. The law is presented from the ritual, not from the moral, point of view. Salvation by works is not rejected because of man's inability to keep the law, cf. Romans chapter 7, verses 9 through 24, but because material offerings cannot remove guilt, cf. chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. To Paul, man is carnal, cf. Romans chapter 7, verse 14. To this writer, the law is, chapter 9, verse 10, chapter 10, verse 4, chapter 13, verse 9. Paul's versatility was great, but his theological conceptions did not thus change their molds. At the same time, this epistle notably coincides with Paul's both in substantial doctrine. Compare chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, and Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 and 16, Ephesians chapter 1, verse 20. Compare chapter 2, verse 10, and Romans chapter 11, verse 36. Compare chapter 7, verse 25, and Romans chapter 8, verse 34, chapter 7, verse 27, and Romans chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. Compare chapter 2, verse 9, and Philippians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, chapter 2, verse 3, and 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 27. Compare chapter 2, verse 4, and 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 11, chapter 9, verse 27 and 28, and Titus chapter 2, verse 13. And in a particular form of quotation, compare chapter 10, verse 30, and Romans chapter 12, verse 19. Hence it probably emanated from one of his friends. It is impossible to affirm positively who wrote it, but of all the guesses that have been made, the most plausible is that which attributes it to Barnabas. 273. The epistle was certainly addressed to Hebrews. See especially chapter 1, verse 1, chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, chapter 12, verses 18 through 24, and chapter 13, verse 13. They were a definite community. Cf. chapter 5, verse 12, chapter 6, verse 10, chapter 10, verses 32 through 34, chapter 13, verse 7, which had long existed. Cf. chapter 5, verse 12, had suffered imprisonment and loss of goods. Cf. chapter 10, verses 32 to 34, but had not, as a community, endured bloody persecution. Cf. chapter 12, verse 4. A great crisis was impending which threatened painful separation from their former associations. Cf. chapter 10, verse 25, chapter 12, verse 27, chapter 13, verses 13 and 14. These allusions point to Christians of Palestine. To no other was the reproach so applicable that, by reason of time, ye ought to be teachers. Chapter 5, verse 12. It cannot be ascertained, however, whether it was sent to the Church of Jerusalem, or to some neighboring community, or to a portion of the Jerusalem Church which had, on the approach of the war, left the city. It is to be dated shortly before the fall of Jerusalem, since the temple service was still in operation. Cf. chapter 8, verses 4 and 5, chapter 10, verse 25, chapter 13, verses 10 through 14. We may assign it to 67 or 68 AD. Its place of composition is unknown. The phrase, "They of Italy salute you," chapter 13, verse 24, may indicate that the writer was in Italy, or merely that certain Italians were with him. 274. The first epistle of Peter was addressed to the Christians in the provinces of Asia Minor. Its allusions to persecution, cf. chapter 1, verse 7, chapter 3, verse 15, chapter 4, verses 12 and 16, point clearly to the period following the outbreak of Nero's cruelty, AD 64. The apostle was in Babylon, chapter 5, verse 13. This term has often been regarded as a pseudonym for Rome, and the supposition would seem to be supported by the allusions to persecution. Yet the simple epistolary character of the document makes the literal sense more probable. The letter was known to and freely used by the earliest post-apostolic writers, nor is there reason to doubt its claim to be the work of the apostle. 275. The genuineness of the second epistle of Peter has been more doubted than that of any New Testament book, but substantial reasons may be given for accepting its explicit claims. Traces of its use in the 2nd century, though few, are not wanting and have been reinforced by the lately recovered apocryphal Apocalypse of Peter, dating from about AD 150, which draws largely from it. It explicitly claims to be by Peter, and we should be slow to believe that the churches, which rejected other works pretending to be his, were imposed on by so daring a forgery. The writer alludes to his previous epistle, cf. chapter 3, verse 1, and shows the same fondness for reminiscences of his life with Jesus, chapter 1, verse 14, and verses 16 through 18, which is found in 1 Peter, chapter 1, verses 3, 8, and 21, chapter 2, verses 21 and 23, chapter 5, verses 1 and 5. In it, as in the other, stress is laid on prophecy, chapter 1, verses 19 through 21, chapter 3, verses 2 and 13. And the mind is fixed on the glory to come, chapter 1, verse 4, 11, 19, chapter 3, verse 4, 10, and 12 through 14. It is true that he emphasizes more than in the first epistle, chapter 4, verses 5 and 17, the Advent as the time of punishment, chapter 2, verse 1, 3, 9, 13, and chapter 3, verse 7. But this was because he was rebuking false teachers and evil men. The doctrinal point of view of both epistles is the same. Compare, for example, 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3, and 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4, chapter 3, verse 9, and 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 9 and 13. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 10, and 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 2. chapter 5, verse 10, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 1, and 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 18. And while some new phrases occur in the second epistle, they belonged to the common Christian vocabulary. In both epistles there is the same stress on practical faith and godliness, the same absence of doctrinal discussion, the same use of Old Testament illustrations. Cf. 2 Peter chapter 2 and 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 6 and 20. In both epistles also is to be noted the disposition to use the writings of Christian contemporaries. 1 Peter contains many echoes of the epistles of James and Paul, while in 2 Peter there is not only a specific reference to Paul's epistles, in chapter 3, verses 15 and 16, but an extensive use of the epistle of Jude, compare chapter 2, verse 1, and Jude, verse 4, chapter 2, verse 4, and Jude, verse 6, chapter 2, verse 10, and Jude, verse 8, chapter 2, verse 11, and Jude, verse 9, chapter 2, verse 12, and Jude, verse 10, chapter 2, verse 13, and Jude, verse 12. A certain roughness of style, when compared with 1 Peter, is to be acknowledged, but is quite an insufficient ground on which to deny a common authorship. The epistle was probably written from Rome shortly before the apostle's death. It was addressed to part at least of the same circle of churches to whom the first epistle had been sent. 276. The Epistle of Jude seems to have been written about AD 65 or 67. The author calls himself a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James, in verse 1. He was therefore not an apostle, but one of the brethren of Jesus, and like James, cf. James chapter 1, verse 1, felt himself worthy to be called only a servant of his Messiah brother. His language implies that James was better known than himself, and probably that he wrote after James's death. It might seem also to indicate that he addressed Jewish Christians, but 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5 shows that the brethren of the Lord were, like Peter, evangelists well known to the Gentile churches, and since Peter in his later years addressed Gentiles, Jude may have done the same. It is moreover difficult to suppose that the persons whom Jude denounced had appeared in Jewish Christian churches, cf. verses 4 through 8. Their errors look rather like the abuse of Pauline teaching, compare with Romans chapter 6, verses 1 through 11. We may conjecture that the readers lived in some part of Asia Minor. The same facts point also to a date contemporaneous with the pastoral epistles. The false Christians of Jude cannot indeed be identified with the false teachers of 1 Timothy and Titus. They agree more nearly with those described in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. Jude and the pastorals, however, belong to the same general situation. 277. During the seventh decade appeared also the Synoptic Gospels. The first, from the earliest times attributed to Matthew, was written from the point of view of a Jewish Christian emancipated from Judaism. As early as about AD 140, Papias, we find the statement that Matthew wrote originally in Hebrew. If so, the relation of our Greek Gospel to the original is a difficult problem about which the last word has not yet been written. Many modern scholars believe that the original consisted only or mainly of a collection of Christ's discourses, and that our Gospel was called Matthew's because it embodies these discourses with historical matter derived from another source. But from what we know of the apostolic preaching, it is improbable that an early Gospel did not contain the acts as well as the words of Jesus, and especially that it did not contain a history of the Passion. This theory, moreover, rests upon an interpretation of the word logia, used by Papias to describe Matthew's work, in the sense of discourses, whereas the term is employed in the New Testament, by Philo and by the early Fathers, in the sense of oracles, or divine communications, and is constantly applied to inspired books, either in whole or in their parts. We are not warranted, therefore, in departing from the belief, which the same line of tradition affirmed, that our first Gospel was the work of Matthew. Possibly he issued both a Hebrew and a Greek edition. The efforts of recent scholars to recover the original Hebrew by retranslation, either of this Gospel alone, or of it in combination with Mark and Luke, cannot be regarded as successful. 278. Our second Gospel was universally considered in the 2nd century to have been written by Mark at Rome, and to have embodied largely the preaching of Peter, whose interpreter Mark was said to have become. Its connection with Peter is somewhat confirmed by the fact that it lays stress on the miraculous events of Jesus' life, as Peter always did. Cf. Acts chapter 2 verse 22, chapter 10 verse 38, 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 3, 2 Peter chapter 1 verses 16 and 17, and contains a number of vivid details which indicate the recollection of an observant eyewitness. For example, chapter 3 verse 5, chapter 5 verses 39 and 40, chapter 8 verses 12 and 34. It was plainly written for Gentiles. Compare with chapter 1 verse 9, chapter 5 verse 41, chapter 7 verses 3 and 4, chapter 12 verse 42, chapter 14 verse 13, chapter 15 verse 42, and is a graphic, pictorial narrative descriptive, especially of the power of Jesus, the Son of God. There is no reason to doubt that we possess it in its original form, save that the last 12 verses are wanting. The original conclusion seems to have been lost, and was replaced, not later than the beginning of the 2nd century, by our present text, compiled from the other Gospels and other sources. 279. Our third Gospel was written by the author of Acts. Cf. Acts chapter 1 verses 1 and 2, who has already been identified as Luke. Cf. section 3. This Gospel shows more of the spirit and method of an historian than do the other synoptics. He expressly states the care with which he collected his material. Cf. chapter 1 verses 1 through 4, deriving it, doubtless, both from earlier documents and personal communication with the original actors in the primitive history. He seems to have contemplated from the start the composition of both his works, and to have aimed at a systematic presentation of the rise and establishment of Gentile Christianity. His Gospel should probably be assigned also to the years AD 60 through 70. At any rate, his report of Christ's prediction of the fall of Jerusalem is not, as some maintain, sufficient ground for dating the book after that event, since his language, in chapter 21, verse 20, is only an interpretation of Christ's words. Compare with Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, and Mark chapter 13, verse 14. Designed to make their meaning clear to Gentile readers, and that the Christians, on the basis of Christ's teaching, expected the destruction of the city, is proved by Mark's report as well as by much other evidence. It is not improbable that Luke gathered his materials while Paul was in prison at Caesarea, and that he wrote his Gospel in Rome. The influence upon him of Paul appears from the stress he lays on the universal mission of Christ. For example, chapter 2, verse 32, chapter 4, verses 16 through 30, chapter 13, verses 28 through 30, chapter 14, verses 16 through 24, chapter 19, verse 10, chapter 24, verse 47. And from the connection between certain passages in his narrative and Paul's statements. Compare with Luke chapter 10, verse 7, and 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 18, Luke chapter 10, verse 8, and 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 27, Luke chapter 22, verses 19 through 21, and 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 25, Luke chapter 24, verse 34, and 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 5. 280. At some time subsequent to the composition of the third Gospel, Luke issued the Acts, a discussion of which has already been given in sections 3 through 6. Its exact date is still a matter of dispute. Its closing words cannot be held to prove that it was written, as many have thought, immediately after the 2 years of Paul's first Roman imprisonment. It can only be dated roughly in the period following Paul's release, up to the probable term of Luke's life, say AD 63 through 75. Its high value as a source for apostolic history has been repeatedly shown in our narrative. 281. Finally, we have from the closing years of the first century the Joannian literature. It is true that the Apostle's authorship of all or some of the 5 books which go by his name has been hotly debated. But that they existed and were used like other apostolic books at the beginning of the 2nd century is certain. That the author of the 4th Gospel wrote also the epistles is indisputable from the identity of vocabulary and style. Examination also confirms the traditional belief that he was the writer of Revelation. It is true that the latter book has many grammatical constructions peculiar to it, but these were due to its apocalyptic style and the influence on it of the language of older prophecies. The Gospel and Revelation are both in thoroughly Hebraistic style, have a large body of peculiar words and phrases in common, while their leading doctrinal ideas are identical and some of them unique among the books of the New Testament. For example, compare John chapter 1 verse 1 and Revelation chapter 19 verse 13, John chapter 1 verse 28, chapter 19 verse 36, and Revelation chapter 5 verse 6, chapter 13 verse 8, John chapter 3 verse 29, and Revelation chapter 21 verses 2 and 9, John chapter 19 verse 34, and Revelation chapter 1 verse 7, John chapter 8 verse 44, and Revelation chapter 2 verse 9, John chapter 7 verse 37, and Revelation chapter 22 verse 17. Still less is there ground for supposing that any other John than the Apostle was the author. Besides being evidently a Jew, and showing himself intimately familiar with the geography and customs of Palestine during Christ's time, he closes his Gospel with the explicit statement that he was the disciple whom Jesus loved, chapter 21, verses 20 and 24. And none will doubt that by that phrase we are to understand the son of Zebedee. It is to be noted that the statement is not only that "this is the disciple which testifieth of these things," as if the author obtained his information from John, but it is added that he "wrote these things." We learn also from the first epistle that he was an eyewitness of Jesus' life, chapter 1 verse 1, and wrote in the name of the apostolic body, chapter 1 verses 3 through 5. The Gospel and first epistle are to be dated AD 80 through 90. 282. With regard to the Revelation, it may be further remarked that its style and vocabulary proves it to be the work of one hand throughout. The opinion has recently found favor that the author incorporated into his book earlier apocalypses. Such a procedure is not in itself inconceivable, but the arguments advanced for it assume interpretations of some passages and views of the relation of thought between visions and parts of visions, which are not demonstrable, and which, in view of the literary unity of the book, go beyond the limits of safe criticism. On the other hand, critical opinion appears to be steadily returning to the traditional view that the Revelation was composed in the latter part of the reign of Domitian, between AD 90 and 96. We are not concerned with the value of the Joannian writings for the life of Christ. They throw, however, much light on the external situation of the churches of Asia during the last quarter of the first century, and still more on the currents of thought which were then felt among the Christians. End of chapter 23.